Hello. What was both expected and feared has, unfortunately, happened. The U.S. has now entered the Israel-Iran war. The U.S. Air Force carried out an extraordinary operation, striking Iran's nuclear test sites using the legendary B-2 stealth bombers. This was officially announced by the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff himself. 125 aircraft were used in a single operation. The fleet included stealth bombers, B-2s, fifth-generation fighter jets, F-35s, F-16s, and aerial refueling tankers. Iran's air defense systems had already been crippled by Israeli strikes, and the U.S. planes reportedly returned to their bases without any losses. Additionally, a U.S. submarine equipped with guided missiles also participated in the operation, launching 20 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now that the U.S. is involved, everyone is wondering, what is happening and what will happen next? To truly understand today, we need to rewind a bit, to see clearly how past actions have led us to this point. Please, sit back. If you're driving, pull over. Be late to work if you must. Let me remind you of a few things, not explain, but remind, with a sort of mini-documentary. Until 2003, Turkey's vision of Palestine was centered entirely around Yasser Arafat and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. When the AKP, Justice and Development Party, came to power in 2003, just 1 year later, Yasser Arafat, widely regarded as the embodiment of the Palestinian cause, died. He had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with Israeli leaders Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres for successfully bringing Israel and Palestine to the negotiating table. With Arafat's death, a major shift occurred in Turkey, the first tangible axis shift. The Turkish Republic, which had always viewed the world from Ankara's perspective, changed its stance for the first time in history under the AKP government. Historically, Turkey had always stood by Arafat and acted as a friendly mediator between Israel and Palestine. But now, it abandoned that vision. Turkey turned its back on Fatah, which Arafat founded and led, and instead embraced Hamas. In 2006, elections were held in Palestine, the first without Arafat, and Hamas won. At the time, Turkish media was still independent and not yet partisan. The headlines called it Kalash, because Hamas members, masked and armed with Kalashnikovs, took victory laps through the streets. For the first time in history, Palestine was divided both geographically and ideologically. Arafat's Fatah was secular. Hamas was a radical Islamist group. On the world stage, Fatah represented the Palestinian state. Hamas, labeled a terrorist organization, was not recognized by any country except Iran. Yet, under our government's guidance, the Turkish public was led to believe that Hamas was Palestine, even though Hamas had actually been founded as a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, explicitly to oppose Arafat's Fatah. Hamas was created to seize control of Gaza, the geographical half of Palestine. In fact, before fighting Israel, Hamas first clashed with Fatah in 2007, leading to the deaths of over 1,000 Palestinians. Iran supported Hamas not only with weapons, rockets, and money but also provided military training, tactical advice, and facilitated cooperation with Hezbollah in Lebanon. On October 7, 2023, the Jewish Sabbath, Hamas launched a surprise operation with a rain of rockets. Some say 2,000. Others say 5,000 rockets were fired at once. Militants crossed the Israeli border using powered paragliders, broke down fences with trucks, and stormed civilian settlements. Over 300 Israeli civilians, mostly women and some children, were killed. More than 200 were taken hostage and transported back to Gaza. In Gaza, there was celebration. Given the hatred toward Israel, that was expected. But the shocking part was the reaction in Turkey. In cities like Istanbul, people honked horns in celebration. Some prayed prayers of gratitude in mosques. In pro-government media, headlines were filled with joy, mockery, and glee. Articles proclaimed Mossad was humiliated, the Iron Dome was shredded like paper, and Netanyahu is looking for a hole to hide in. TV pundits smirked as they declared, "This is the real Israel, not so powerful after all." They mocked both Israel and its backer, the U.S., saying they were both disgraced. And through it all, Hamas was praised. The government's support for Hamas, under the guise of supporting Palestine, was portrayed as righteous and visionary. Do we remember that day? One person who offered a prayer of gratitude was none other than Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. Photos of him praying in his office were shared across global media. And in those photos, in the office library, a Turkish flag is visible, because on the very day of that attack, Hamas leader Haniyeh was proudly flying the Turkish flag, while Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was seen performing a prayer of gratitude, reportedly in Istanbul. This claim was never denied. So, while Turkey was practically celebrating, what did Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas say? He stated, "Hamas has given Israel the perfect excuse to attack Gaza." Yes, a completely accurate assessment. But our media didn't like this statement at all. They censored it. While Abbas's remarks were covered by the global press, in Turkey they were completely hidden, concealed from the public. In other words, our esteemed media believed they understood the Palestinian issue even better than Mahmoud Abbas himself. They acted as if they knew Israel better than Abbas did, as if he had no idea what he was talking about. And then, sadly, we all saw what happened next. Gaza was reduced to rubble, practically erased from the map. Hamas was destroyed. The same Haniyeh who had offered a prayer of gratitude was later killed in Tehran. Iran's president and its foreign minister, regarded as a kind of caliph figure, died in what was officially labeled a helicopter crash, shouting, "This is an assassination," before their deaths. Hezbollah militants in Lebanon had their communication devices, pagers, radios, phones, destroyed. Beirut was bombed. Hezbollah's entire presence was annihilated. Israeli tanks invaded southern Lebanon. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah was killed. The Assad regime in Syria collapsed. Israel pushed beyond the demilitarized zone, for the first time since 1973, entering Syrian territory and seizing the Golan Heights. Israeli aircraft began using Syrian airspace like it was their own backyard. And then came the final act, the biggest target, Iran. Israel began targeting Iran directly, assassinating Iran's chief of staff and its nuclear scientists. Finally, the United States entered the stage. The main actor arrived. The U.S. Air Force struck Iran's nuclear test sites. Yesterday, Donald Trump openly declared he wanted regime change in Iran. October 7, 2023, was the turning point. Those in Turkey who celebrated Hamas's attack, believing Israel was caught off guard like fools. What are they thinking now? It was obvious back then too. I even explained it here on YouTube at the time. NATO has a concept called emotional environment. Officers are trained in this. When a powerful emotional event occurs, or is manufactured, both local populations and international public opinion become emotionally compromised. While they're overwhelmed by emotion, pre-planned actions are suddenly put into motion. Vietnam was an example. They claimed American destroyers were attacked by North Vietnam. The U.S. Senate approved military retaliation. But it was a lie. No such attack had occurred. Yet before the lie was uncovered, the war began, and 2 million people died. Iraq was another example. They claimed Saddam had chemical missiles that could hit European cities like Paris, London, and Rome. Of course, that was a lie too. But by the time the truth came out, Iraq had already been invaded and destroyed. First, emotions are triggered. Global support is gained. Then the well-prepared plan is calmly executed. Hamas's so-called victory attack was a textbook example of the emotional environment concept. It was served to social media by an invisible hand, deliberately. Do you remember those horrific videos of Hamas militants flying in on paragliders, shooting civilians? They were circulated non-stop on social media. Thanks to those videos, whether real or staged, Israel suddenly became the global victim and gained legitimacy to carry out its long-prepared plans. Gaza, Lebanon, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, these dominoes didn't fall by accident. To not see that this series of operations had been planned in coordination with the US and UK for at least 2 to 3 years is to be willfully blind. Those who view the world through religious ideology rather than reason and diplomacy couldn't see this reality. They couldn't grasp that the Hamas attack, in fact, handed a lifeline to Israel's deeply unpopular and embattled Prime Minister Netanyahu, strengthening his hand overnight. Those who entered the world of MI6 and Mossad with a public bus pass mindset failed to see that Hamas was being used like a puppet, a tool. To those who celebrated in Turkey with horns and prayers after Hamas killed civilians, please listen carefully. On September 11, 2001, The United States was attacked on its own soil for the first time in history. For commercial planes were hijacked by radical terrorists, as was claimed. 2 crashed into New York's Twin Towers, 110 stories high, which burned and collapsed like torches. 1 hit the Pentagon. The 4th was shot down by U.S. jets before reaching its target in Washington. A total of 2,977 Americans died. The world was shocked. In some countries with less critical thinking, people celebrated. They honked their horns, did victory laps, and performed gratitude prayers because America had been hit. But do you know what Yasser Arafat, leader of the PLO and president of Palestine, did on that day? Let me remind you with emphasis. He ran to the nearest medical center and donated blood for the wounded Americans. Yes, Arafat laid down on a stretcher, extended his arm, and gave blood. This moment was shared with the entire world through the media. He filmed it. He had it recorded. He had his blood donation broadcast to the world. Of course, the U.S. didn't need a blood donation. But it was symbolic, a diplomatic gesture of immense moral value. Arafat was showing that both he and the Palestinian people stood against that extremist terror attack, that they were on the side of the American people. Because Arafat, having been through the ringer of global politics, knew very well how powerful, how devastating the U.S. could be. He knew that after September 11th, the U.S. would scorch the earth, and that no one would get away with it. So he lay on that stretcher and gave blood, symbolically, to protect his own people, to prevent Palestine from getting hit while others were being crushed. He even gave a short interview while donating blood. Terror is our enemy, too. We are also victims of terrorism. He didn't stop there. Arafat sent a personally selected 20-member Palestinian delegation to the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. At the time, it wasn't yet an embassy. There, they lit candles in memory of the victims of 9/11 and offered their condolences. Why? Because Arafat was smart. He had spent his life fighting Mossad, the CIA, MI6. He could foresee that the U.S. would use 9/11 as a pretext to execute pre-planned operations, to burn down entire nations. By making that symbolic gesture, the blood donation, he saved his people from the fire. Hamas, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of this diplomatic intelligence. They were founded to oppose Arafat's PLO, an organization with political maturity. And when Hamas thought they had achieved victory by attacking Israel and celebrated with prayers of gratitude, they were actually setting the entire region, from Gaza to Lebanon, Syria to Iran, and even Turkey, on fire. We now see what that brought. Because we weren't even extras in someone else's script, we're stuck just watching the show. And since we're just spectators, we don't know how this movie will end. The only thing I know as a journalist is this. We must learn from what has happened so far if we want to shape the future. If we fail to learn from today, our moral compass, not just our geopolitical axis, is bound to go off course. Take Iran, for example. Unfortunately, due to its incompetent theocratic regime, it cannot compete militarily with Israel, let alone the United States. But Iran's geography is a geopolitical diamond. Yes, a geopolitical diamond. What's happening now may seem like a current crisis, but it has always been this way. Throughout history, Iran's territory has always been a battleground for great powers. That's why, for instance, during both World Wars, Iran was jointly occupied by the British and Russians. During World War I, Iran's leadership was pro-Nazi. To prevent its energy lines from falling into Nazi hands, the UK and USSR invaded. Iran's value lies in energy production, energy transit, and its strategic position in arms trade. I am not saying Iranians are important to the global powers. Iran's geography is what matters to them. The people, they don't care. So what happens in Iran never just affects Iran. History proves this. Every major development there triggers a chain of events. Remember 1979, the Iranian Revolution? At the time, people thought it was just about Iran. But look what happened within just 2 years. Khomeini returned to Iran and completed the clerical revolution. The USSR invaded Afghanistan. Turkey saw a military coup under Kenan Evren. U.S. President Reagan was shot. Pope John Paul II was shot by Mehmet Ali Agca. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated. The Iran-Iraq War began, engineered by global intelligence. Over 1.5 million died. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Iran was the first domino, and it toppled the whole region. We must look at any development in Iran within this broader context. Did you know? Khomeini was exiled by the Shah of Iran in 1964. And where did he go? Turkey. He stayed in Ankara briefly, then was taken to Bursa, where he lived in the home of Turkish military intelligence officer Colonel Ali Chetiner, who spoke Persian. He later moved to Iraq, and finally to France, where he orchestrated his entire return and revolution. But no one ever asked, why was Khomeini hosted in Turkey? Why Ankara? Why Bursa? Why a colonel? Let's jump ahead to the present. In May last year, Iran's President Raisi's helicopter crashed, just like after the revolution. What happened immediately after Raisi's death? Trump was targeted in an assassination attempt. Coincidence? No connection. Back then, the USSR invaded Afghanistan. Now, Russia is invading Ukraine. Back then, Anwar Sadat and Indira Gandhi were killed. Now, Bashar al-Assad has been eliminated. Are all of these just random, unrelated events? Iran remains the first domino that can topple an entire region. That's why I insist, this is not about government or opposition. We must always look at the world through Ankara's lens, with diplomacy, strategy, and unity. We must keep our internal front strong, with democracy, rule of law, meritocracy, and our founding principles. From an economic standpoint, here's the situation. Turkey imports 92% of its oil and 98 to 99% of its natural gas. When Brent crude was around $80 per barrel, we paid $65 billion last year for energy imports. But now, with war on the horizon and the Strait of Hormuz at risk of closing, oil prices may very well exceed $100 per barrel. They're almost certain that it will happen. They're not saying it might rise to $120 or so. They're saying if it hits $100, what would that mean for us? If oil hits $100, it means our annual energy import bill will jump from $65 billion to $97 billion. Yes, for 2025, that also means snow falling in the middle of summer for inflation. Look, diesel has already hit 55 lira. What does it mean when diesel and gasoline prices go up? It means price hikes in everything, from needles to thread. If Hormuz gets shut down, will diesel hit 70 lira? It could. That's what they're saying. And it may not stop there. The impact might go beyond just inflation. Turkey imports about 10 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Iran every year. We keep hearing about gas discoveries, but we've been buying this gas from Iran every year for 2 months. Where does this gas come from? From the South Pars gas field, which is the largest natural gas field in the world. Now Israel is bombing that area. Yes, Israel is actively targeting military facilities in that region. As a result, there are already disruptions in production. But what if they directly strike the gas facilities? What happens if South Pars is hit? The only country that will be directly affected is us, Turkey. Just us. Because we are practically the only significant country Iran exports natural gas to. If this line is cut off, Turkey's industry would collapse. Almost all of Turkish industry's electricity is supplied via this gas from Iran. Let's remember January 2022, 3 years ago. Turkey quietly supported Israel, and Iran responded. They said it was a malfunction, a pipeline rupture, etc. They shut off the gas for just 1 week in midwinter, and Turkish industry instantly went into a coma. A coma. In our industrial zones, in Bursa, Sakarya, Istanbul, especially automotive factories, for the first time in our history, electricity was cut off for 3 days. Production halted completely. If South Pars is bombed, just imagine what could happen in Turkey. Before every election, they claim to have found oil, in Gaber, they say. Just fill up the tank, fire it up, the quality is so high, they say. We supposedly found gas in the Black Sea that would shift global balances. But look at our reality. If Iran cuts the gas, our industry stops.